Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 754 of People Behind the Science. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today we are excited to be resharing our conversation with our guest, Dr. Joel Fodrie, originally released on November 16th of 2015. Listeners, Joel studies estuaries, which are habitats where fresh water from rivers and streams mixes with the salt water of the ocean. He acts as a sort of detective to investigate how things like salt marshes, seagrasses, and oyster reefs keep this habitat healthy and to determine what might be driving observed changes in fish abundance in these areas. And in our interview, Joel talks about his life, his career, and also his research. So we hope you are ready for this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of People Behind the Science. I am excited to be here today with Dr. Joel Fodrie. So, Joel, welcome to our show today. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. We are excited to chat with you today about you, your work, and your experiences in science. But before we dive into all that, I want to give our listeners just a little bit of background information about you. So listeners, Joel is an assistant professor in the Institute of Marine Sciences and Department of Marine Sciences at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He received his undergraduate training in biology and history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and he went on to receive his Ph.D. in Biological Oceanography from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography at the University of California, San Diego. Afterward, Joel conducted postdoctoral research with the Marine Sciences Consortium at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab. Joel served on the faculty at the University of South Alabama before joining the faculty at UNC Chapel Hill, where he is today. And listeners, Joel is here with us today to talk about his experiences in life and science. So Joel, we're excited to get to know you both as a scientist, but also as a person. So can you start off by telling us what you like to do with your time when you're not busy doing science?
I have two small boys, a 9-year-old and a 4-year-old, and they merit and demand a fair bit of time, and they're fun to hang out with. I do like getting out in the water. I grew up fishing and doing some water activity like surfing and kneeboarding. I had a boat since I was 13 years old. Still have the boat.
Oh, wow.
I enjoy basketball a fair bit, so I play once or twice a week. And formerly, I used to read a fair bit of history in the evenings to sort of relax.
Interesting. So is there a particular period in history that you're fascinated with?
Oh, absolutely. I love Revolutionary era history, and even more particular, the biographies about the founding fathers, who I just find fascinating. I could bore you for hours.
Well, I think that is so cool. And I was interested that you had this double major in biology and history in college. So do you find that you are able to still indulge in your interest in history, though you're quite busy with science?
Probably not as much as I'd like to, but we do in our lab have a great respect for the research that was done 50, 100 years ago and data sets that were collected in the past. And so we try to find those records and then use those records to inform us about the status of fisheries or habitats today. It is great fun even going to libraries. We've done this and looking at old newspapers for reports about catches or conditions in the past.
Very cool. Well, Joel, great to get a window into your life outside of science. It sounds like this fascination with fish follows you outside the laboratory as well. So have you gotten your little boys interested in fishing and marine science?
The older one, the 9-year-old, is very much a thespian, I think. So he likes acting and singing. He does enjoy being outside. He's always loved the water. The younger one, the 4-year-old, is at the moment a bit skittish of the water. I think he's turning a corner, so we'll see if he turns out to be a water person.
Gotcha. Just got to give him time. But great to hear, like I said, about your life outside of science. But we are going to turn to your scientific side next. So Joel, can you tell us how you describe what you do at work to someone who might not be familiar with science?
So thematically, our lab studies estuaries, that interface between the land and the ocean. We like to investigate what keeps habitats healthy, like salt marshes and seagrasses and oyster reefs. And we also do a lot with the fishes that live in our estuaries. Most of the recreationally and commercially valuable fisheries we have in the States are considered to be estuarine dependent, meaning that those species enter estuaries at some point. Practically, I like to think of myself as a detective. So we've got some case about fish being more abundant or less abundant, and there's all these potential drivers of that. It could be increased mortality, or they're moving, or the habitats have changed. And so we bring to bear all sorts of approaches, real intensive sampling, those historical records, experiments where we manipulate some sort of resource or some sort of threat. And we try to understand more precisely what regulates those populations. We try to be fairly clever and efficient with how we design those experiments to gain sort of strong insight into what controls populations or habitats that we care about.
Very interesting. Well, Joel, I'm looking forward to chatting more about your work as we go through the interview, but I want to talk next about what motivates you. I think there is so much to get done in a day, particularly when you're juggling science, a family, and all your other interests in life. So can you tell us, do you have a particular favorite motivational quote or saying that you like to keep with you as you go through your day?
People make fun of me in our lab because I love expressions and quotes. Mm-hmm. And probably my favorite one pertains to science is one that I think comes from the play Cato. And it was one of George Washington's favorite quotes. And it goes something like, "We can't guarantee success, but we can deserve it." And in science, you do have a fair number of things that don't work out. Working in the water is logistically difficult, and the best laid schemes often fail. But we sort of have a we can do it attitude in our lab, and we sample and we do restoration ecology at fairly big scales, kind of a brute force attack sometimes. We're never guaranteed that something will work out, but we try to earn the right to have it work out.
Well, I like that approach, and that is a fantastic quote, I think, with so many applications to science, particularly when you're doing these kinds of field experiments, field work, and trying to make a big impact on the world. So great quote to keep in your mind. And next, I want to talk about some of the people who've maybe motivated you or inspired you, or even just had a big impact on your career as you've gone through. So can you share with us who you'd consider some of your role models?
In our field, I think you probably develop your first insights when you're in college. And I was lucky to have a really good undergraduate mentor who helped guide me through an honors thesis. His name is Pete Peterson, and I'm lucky to have him as a colleague now. And then when I went to grad school in marine sciences, you often pick the school you want to go to based upon a specific person you want to work with. And so my advisor in grad school was a person named Lisa Levin, and she's just head and shoulders the best scientist that I know. So for 6 years, I just sort of learned through osmosis about how to try to be a good scientist. And then as a postdoc, I continued with sort of a lucky streak and had a really good experience and had wonderful mentors. Worked with a fellow named Sean Powers closely, and then sort of more formally had a fellow named Ken Heck, who was my host and mentor as a postdoc. So those people that I've worked most closely with, I had good fortune. And even today, I'm lucky that I've managed to target certain people that I respect in the field. Ken Abel is a fellow who works in New Jersey at Rutgers, and I've been lucky to get to know and work with. One of the joys of showing up here is I really enjoy the people that I work with and the people I get to travel to work with.
Certainly. And I think finding the right mentors as you're going through as a scientist is a really big part of having a good experience. So can you tell us, did you have any particular secrets or strategies when you were going about trying to identify mentors at these different places?
I wish I could say I did. I think I've just been fortunate. There's only so much that you can know about a person until you move somewhere and start to work with them. And I know of people that have had really good experiences and really sort of bad experiences. I would actually say that I'm kind of a rush headlong into things type person. I actually generally don't spend as much time probably being as pensive and as meticulous as other people I know. So I think I've just been lucky.
Gotcha. Well, I think the serendipity plays a big role in science, not only in mentorship selection, but sometimes in project selection and in a variety of other aspects as well. So definitely an important part. But great to hear about some of these people who've had a big impact on you in your career. But I want to back up even farther. And Joel, I want to hear about what got you started on this path to science. So can you tell us, what was this first moment where you started realizing you were interested in science?
Again, serendipity, I think, is a big part of it. So as an undergrad, I was a dual major and would have loved to have been a historian. I just didn't think that I could write well enough to write books that would sell. And I didn't want to be poor. And so the sciences where I felt like there was a better chance to get a job could support me.
Gotcha. Now you have to write papers as a scientist too.
Yeah. And I've always been fortunate that one of my selfish goals was just I enjoyed learning. And so if it was banking or building a house or marine sciences, that sort of spark of, oh, I didn't know that, has always really gratified me. So that's, I guess, a trait that I hope travels. So I knew I was in the sciences probably. I didn't know what I wanted to do. And to be perfectly blunt, I was trying to make the basketball team at Carolina and had been staying summers to try to make the basketball team, and finally got told that I wasn't needed anymore. Wasn't quite good enough.
Oh, no.
And so I was kind of pressed for a summer job. And I was like, well, goodness gracious, what am I going to do? So one day I was walking through the science building at Carolina, and saw these posters on the wall about marine sciences. And I grew up on the water and spent a lot of time on the water, as I mentioned before. And sort of a light bulb went off, and I said, well, oh my goodness, people actually do this for a living. So pretty much went home and sent some emails out to researchers at Carolina and said, here's who I am, would like to maybe get some experience in a lab. I had a couple people call me back and started the summer between my junior and senior year doing research, and just sort of knew immediately upon that experience that this was for me.
Well, that is an awesome story, Joel. I love that this pursuing of marine sciences started with just seeing a poster hanging on the wall. And I think
yeah, it really did.
Definitely this element of serendipity I've heard again and again as I'm talking to scientists about how they started their journey or how they got from one step to another along the way. But can you tell us now, what are then some of these key moments that took you from the student starting to pursue marine sciences to where you are today back at North Carolina?
Well, I think hard work is certainly a part of it. Academic jobs come with a lot of rewards. I think all of us that are here just really enjoy our jobs. We enjoy getting to show up and ask challenging questions. And so it's really competitive. There's no doubt that hard work is a big part of it. And I feel like I've worked hard. I worked hard in school and I worked hard in grad school. You only get yourself so far. Again, that quote of you can't guarantee success, but you can deserve it. Mm-hmm. And certain things have to line up to land you in this spot or that spot. And in my case, again, it was something as kind of random as being at an airport and seeing someone in the field. And I started a conversation, and that led me down a path to end up at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab. And that sort of guided my research for the next 10 years and probably the next 30 years looking forward.
Oh, wow. So can you tell us a little bit about what it was like working at this Dauphin Island Sea Lab?
Yeah, I have been lucky in that I grew up on the East Coast, did grad school on the West Coast, was a postdoc on the Gulf Coast, and now I've come back to the East Coast. So
You've been around, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that's been really good for me. I love North Carolina. I grew up here, but I really, really love the water down on the Gulf Coast. The Gulf is a remarkable place in terms of productivity and in terms of diversity of animals, and the gradients from really turbid, nutrient-rich waters in Louisiana over to really clear, almost tropical waters in Florida, and being able to work across that gradient. The Gulf is also a place where, didn't intend this, but as it turns out, I've been able to explore aspects of climate change. You often see things kind of move north as climates warm. They're sort of tracking a preferred temperature. And so in the course of my research there, we've seen things move from the more tropical Gulf, the southern Gulf, into the northern Gulf. And that's been very interesting and gratifying to get to look at how these things will play out, or at least begin to look. And I started there in 2006. And of course, in 2010, we had the oil spill. So I was positioned in some ways to look at what the oil spill did to fishes in the northern Gulf. And because of that experience, have stayed involved in research since 2010. So I'm lucky that I get to go back at least twice a year for a couple weeks at a time to work with the fishes and sample the fishes. I would have been very happy had fate dictated that I stayed in Alabama. Many people probably don't know that Alabama maybe even has a coastline, but much less that it has a very gorgeous coastline. Really white sandy beaches, in places really beautiful seagrass beds. And just a really productive system in terms of really big fish and, at times, a relative abundance of fishes that makes working there fun.
Very cool. Well, it sounds like a wonderful place to work, Joel. Now, we've heard a little bit about your journey to get to where you are today, but I want to hear now about one of these projects that you have on the table that you are so excited to be a part of right now.
So one of the things that defines our broader lab here at UNC on the coast is that we're very interdisciplinary by nature, meaning that I'm a fish person and we have a person that studies fish, I should say.
You could be a fish person too. That's fine.
Exactly. And we have a coral reef ecologist, and we have a geologist, and we have a physical oceanographer, and we're all in the same hallway, so we talk a lot. And many of us at the lab have found common research themes regarding oyster reefs. Now, when I came back to North Carolina, the last thing I wanted to do was work on oysters.
Really? Why?
They smell bad and they can cut you to death. And
this is true.
Yeah, I came from a background of studying seagrass, which is comparatively
benign in a lot of ways. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. The reason that I got involved in oyster reef work was really just to look at how fish use oyster reefs. And the reason I say that about not wanting to work in oyster reefs is because they've made me a convert. Now I really appreciate oysters, both as a habitat and what it does for us in terms of services like filtering the water, removing excess nitrogen, being habitat for fishes and crabs, but also as a model system. So I've learned a lot about ecology by studying where oysters can live and what regulates that. And then we've approached restoration ecology, what I hope is very scientifically, in the sense that when we build restoration projects, we build them across gradients of depth or salinity or landscape types or sizes of restoration projects. And we try to understand what works best. And that means figuring out what doesn't work at all. So for me to have a successful restoration project, I need some things that maybe look beautiful at the end and some things that just didn't pan out, because then I know where the bounds of success are that can be applied elsewhere. So in a very general sense, I'm really excited about our oyster reef work because we get to work with a geologist to look at how reefs grow through time. Something very simple like, can reefs accrete fast enough to keep up with sea level rise, is something that we couldn't find in the literature. So these colleagues I have at IMS and I set out to measure that and have produced data that say reefs above all coastal habitats have the best ability to keep up with sea level rise. And that means that if we're trying to build resilient shorelines or resilient coast, oyster reefs can be a perhaps very useful tool. And then just sort of the diversity of services that reefs provide in terms of biogeochemical cycling or habitat provision or anchoring a shoreline. Sort of the totality of that work, which brings in different people from different scientific perspectives, has been very rewarding and is a fair part of our ongoing work.
Well, Joel, I think myself and our listeners are all going to leave today with a greater appreciation for oysters and oyster reefs. So thank you for that.
No problem.
This sounds like an exciting project with really important implications. Like you're talking about things like sea level rise and a lot of these problems that we are going to face going into the future, trying to figure out what we can do now to deal with the effects that we're going to have to face down the line. So very important work. And it's interesting, we've been alluding to some of these failures, some of these challenges throughout our interview thus far, particularly with your quote that you can't guarantee success. I think failure is a really big part of science, that a lot of people don't realize how much you fail in science and how many failures underlie each success that you see maybe come out in the media or in the literature. So can you think back now, Joel, on your career and all the times that you may have failed or struggled with something, and share with us one of these stories and how you worked through it?
Two come to mind, so I'll try to be quick, but I'll give you both. The first was just going out of the West Coast. Scientifically, it was tough for me. I had no intuition for the ocean on the West Coast. It's very different. It gets deep very fast, and the water's colder. Generally speaking, they don't have estuaries, which is what I grew up on. And so for 5.5 years, it was a constant struggle for me to think about kelp forest and the different animals they have. And it was frustrating. I just always felt like I was playing catch up. And I think what that did is it made me work harder. And I think that I've been able to carry that forward. And so what I took from that is just hopefully greater stick-to-itiveness.
I like that technical term there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So a more recent one, which was one of these failures I think then does lead to some other understanding, is sort of by chance, we started thinking about how much carbon is in an oyster reef and how much carbon is being buried in an oyster reef. We did some quick calculations based upon two types of carbon that you find in an oyster reef. The first type is in the shell of an oyster. It's calcium carbonate, so there's carbon in the shell. And then the other is the organic carbon that the oyster is filtering out as it feeds and then basically pooping out that gets trapped in the reef matrix. And when we added up how much carbon was being deposited in the oyster reef each year, it was a ton of carbon. Not literally, but just as the expression.
I was like, wow. Yeah.
And when we compared that to carbon burial rates in other habitats, oyster reefs were just off the charts important. So we thought we had this really wonderful story to tell and begun to write a paper, but more importantly, had written a proposal to the National Science Foundation, our sort of leading funding agency. And it was all about measuring this carbon because this is a service. The reefs are scrubbing carbon from the ocean and atmosphere as a service for us. And we had this outstanding number, again, about how much carbon. So had submitted the proposal and felt really good and had 4 or 5 people with me, and we all felt like we had a winner. And I was in my office, sitting right where I'm at now, and I was reading about carbon, and I came across a paper about coral reefs. And coral reefs are made up of calcium carbonate, just like an oyster shell. Mm-hmm. And it's very non-intuitive, but very real. It turns out that when you make calcium carbonate in the ocean, you're actually not scrubbing carbon from the atmosphere. You're actually introducing carbon to the atmosphere.
Oh, no.
CO2 to the atmosphere.
Sure.
And I literally just dropped my head on the table, just banged my head on the table.
Oh, no.
Because this meant that all that carbon that we were seeing in the oyster reefs wasn't necessarily a CO2 sink, but it could, in fact, be a CO2 source. And so that was a painful learning experience where I entered a new field and didn't have all the information that I would have liked to have had. And these proposals have deadlines, so you don't get to pick when you submit always. But what that's done in the long term meant that we actually have more avenues to look at what reefs are doing relative to carbon cycling. And so that was maybe not a painful failure, but it was a memorable failure. And one that I think hasn't killed us. It's just we figured out how to reorientate ourselves to tell the story more accurately. And in some ways, it's given us more avenues to pursue.
Certainly. So had you submitted the proposal when you made this discovery about coral reefs?
Oh, we had submitted it.
Okay.
And what's funny is after I read these, I ended up reading 2 or 3 papers that confirmed this aspect of venting CO2 when you create shell in the ocean. It was like, well, we're going to get killed.
Yeah.
Some reviewer is going to absolutely tell us that we're out to lunch and that we're very naive. And funny enough, not a single reviewer seemed to have a problem with that.
Really?
Yeah. And that's what makes nature so fun, is that it's not always easy to understand what's going on. And when you make that connection for the first time, either personally or perhaps you're the first person on the planet that comes to some new understanding about some dynamic, that's what we're here for. And so this aspect of building shell and inventing CO2 is probably not known by most people. I don't think I'll ever forget it now.
Right. Well, this is an important learning experience. And I think this is important to kind of point out that these aha or eureka moments in science can be both good and bad. You can have a, oh my gosh, I failed moment. But
yeah.
So wonderful story to share with our listeners today. And I think important lessons that our listeners who might be aspiring scientists can learn from hearing these stories from people who've gone through it once to maybe save them the pain down the line. But we don't just want to talk about the difficult times, the struggles, and the failures. So can you tell us next, Joel, about one of your successes? And this can be a big win or just a small victory along the way that meant a lot to you.
Gosh, I guess you remember the failures more than you remember the successes. I've heard coaches say that. Hopefully our lab is doing a good job of publishing some neat results. I mentioned before that working with colleagues, we were able to figure out how fast a reef can grow vertically and produce what I think is the first real number on how fast oyster reefs grow. And it's a big number.
So how fast?
They can grow about 10 centimeters a year.
Wow.
And something like a salt marsh or seagrass meadow, if they're growing a centimeter a year, they're just growing by leaps and bounds. So an oyster reef is just kind of off the charts.
It's like the bamboo of the ocean. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Very cool.
Worked with a former graduate student to produce the first number for how much of our coastline has been hardened. All around the coast, people put up walls to protect their property, to keep the sea out. And most of the credit goes to the student, but I was fortunate to be hopefully helpful and involved. And that number is about 14% of all the coast we have in the lower 48 states has been hardened. And so about 1 out of every 6 feet of shoreline has been hardened. That reflects an important number, an important benchmark.
So now, can you tell us what are the implications of this coastline hardening?
Well, one of the things that our group did, led by the student who was working at IMS, was to correlate where hardening is happening with things like housing density and storminess, GDP at county levels. So what we know is that, not surprisingly, places that have more storms, places where people are, where you tend to have hardening. And projecting forward, the Southeast is one of those places where those things may accelerate. So in terms of how we manage our coastlines, we need to have an eye out for if this hardening persists like at the rate it's been going, we're going to have at least a third, perhaps, of our coastline armored in the very near future. When you armor a coastline, when you harden it, other things can happen, like habitats that are seaward of that wall can be degraded or even lost because there's energy that's bouncing off the walls, and that energy is going to go somewhere. And so one of the expressions is it's called the bathtubization of our sounds and estuaries, because you get these vertical walls and then just deep water. As sea level rises, these habitats like salt marshes and mangroves and even oyster reefs, they can grow up, as I mentioned, like with the oyster reefs, or they can retreat landward. And if you put a wall in the way, at times that can block that retreat and cause what's called a coastal squeeze, where the habitat has nowhere to go. It's in between a wall and a rising sea. I don't particularly spend a lot of time in the management world yet. I'm still trying to get my bearings with the ecology. But I do hope this is a paper that managers will be able to look at and form users to make better decisions about how to manage coast.
Certainly. Well, congratulations on this exciting work coming out of your laboratory. It sounds like you are keeping quite busy with all the research that you're doing. But you also mentioned in the beginning that you've enjoyed reading history books, biographies, things like that when you can squeeze in the time. So I want to get a book recommendation from you today, Joel. Can you tell us about a book that you've read and really enjoyed? And this could be a science book or a non-science book.
It would definitely, in my case, actually not be a science book. And this is a bit of a catch-all. I should try to answer more specifically. But any book by David McCullough, I think people would enjoy. I've bought his new book about the Wright brothers, but haven't read it yet. He wrote a book about the building of the Panama Canal called The Path Between the Seas. When I picked it up, I was like, well, I want to enjoy this. And it was fascinating. And he wrote a wonderful biography about Harry Truman, which I think started me with my real interest in history. I read that when I was in college, and it just sort of sparked something in me. He wrote one of the absolute best biographies of John Adams. And so David McCullough wrote a book about the Brooklyn Bridge, building the Brooklyn Bridge. He just seems to have a real knack for how he writes and telling a compelling narrative. But yeah, any biography of the Founding Fathers. Joseph Ellis is another author that a lot of what he writes I find to be very digestible and informative.
Well, these sound like excellent books. I will put these authors out on our website and a couple of the examples you listed for our listeners to find if they're ready to take a break from scientific reading and maybe dive into some history. And now we've talked a little bit about the places you've been as you've gone through your scientific career, Joel. And I think scientists get to travel a lot, whether it's moving around to different places for job opportunities and openings, or whether it's to go to conferences or to do field work. So can you think back now on all the places that you've traveled for your scientific career and share with us your favorite place? And what was it about this place that made it so memorable for you?
It's a bit ironic in that I consider myself a homebody, but I've been able to travel a fair bit. As you mentioned, we often do in our field. I've been to Hong Kong and done work off of Alaska, and we have ongoing work in the Galapagos Islands and have been to the Baltic. But my favorite place is probably Port St. Joe, Florida, in St. Joseph Bay, which is in the Panhandle region of Florida. And it's just this wonderful mix of temperate and tropical habitats and fauna. It's fairly undeveloped. So when you get in the bay, and this bay is on the order of 10 miles north to south to 3 miles east to west. And it just, again, has these beautiful white beaches. The beaches even get pink.
Really?
Because there's a diatom that lives in the sand. And when it comes to the surface, it gives the sand a pink hue.
Very cool.
Yeah, if I could pick a place to do research tomorrow, that would certainly be it.
So what brought you down there to begin with?
So when I was a postdoc working at Dauphin Island, I was surveying fishes to try to understand what areas are really important in terms of nursery habitats. So if you want to catch species like snapper or grouper, you're probably going to go offshore fishing. That's where the big ones live. But their life history brings them inshore right after they're born or spawned. And when they're small juvenile fishes, they live in coastal seagrass meadows or oyster reefs or around docks or in channels. And it's a difficult thing to track a fish across its entire life. It requires a few years of study, and the fish are basically invisible to us and they move. So again, in terms of that detective mode, we try to bring to bear tools that allow us to understand the ocean better. And in this case, all bony fishes carry around something called an otolith. It's an ear stone. Mm-hmm. And for our purposes, it's basically like a little flight data recorder in that it grows in rings so we can age an individual once it's caught. And then we can use the chemistry that are deposited in those rings to sometimes infer where a fish has come from. So we were surveying fish to collect otoliths to try to create chemical fingerprints of this place or that place, so that when someone catches an adult fish and we can get the otolith, we can look at the chemistry in those juvenile portions of the otolith, those juvenile growth bands, and try to say, this fish has chemistry that suggests it came from Florida or Louisiana or Texas. And so we were doing surveys kind of across the Gulf, and that took me to Port St. Joe.
Well, very cool. It sounds like this is some in-depth marine forensics going on here. So this place sounds phenomenal, and it must be a special place to have beaten out the Galapagos. Can you tell us, what were you doing down there?
UNC has an initiative to work in the Galapagos at multiple levels, on land, in the water, with people. And starting in 2010, I have made, I believe, 4 trips to the Galapagos. The first trip was purely exploratory. The second trip was to begin research. And the third and fourth trip were to teach and continue research. I think it's 4 trips. And what we study down there are the mangroves and how the mangroves support fish reproduction. So we try to understand if, for instance, if the Galapagos had twice as many mangroves or half the mangroves, would they have twice as many fish or half the fish? And for that, we have been tagging fish with what's called an acoustic tag. And this is a tag that you put inside the fish, and then it sends out a chirp, chirp, chirp. And if that fish comes near a receiver that you deploy in the ocean, you get a record of that individual fish having been at that spot at a certain time. So even though I sit here in North Carolina, while we're doing our tagging work, I'm collecting data in the Galapagos basically 24/7. So we ran that project for over a year, and now we're analyzing the data.
Well, that is awesome, Joel. It sounds like you've had so many great opportunities to travel as part of your career as a scientist. And this is one of the things we really do like to highlight, because I think a lot of people don't realize how much of a part of the job it often is. And we've talked a little bit about some of the people you've encountered along your journey as a scientist. And I think the people are another great asset to the career. So you get to work with phenomenal people across different laboratories throughout your career. And I think each laboratory develops its own personality, and there's a lot of quirky traditions that go along with it. And you just share funny or fond memories with the people you've been working with, because ultimately science is done by people, and you work hard, but you like to have fun too. So can you share with us today a story of your own that highlights one of these quirky traditions or a funny memory from science?
I'm probably getting myself in trouble, but the first one that comes to mind is some of our fish sampling is pretty intensive. It's in the field at night, or out in the sun, rain, shine.
Battling the elements, yeah.
Battling the elements. And some of the gears are bulky and they get muddy or stinky, and it can become a love-hate relationship with the sampling devices. And some of these devices are, at least in one case, they're fish traps. And we had some fish traps that were kind of luggage-sized boxes that fish would swim into. And these traps were very old. Mm-hmm. And we hated them because they just were hard to work with and they'd scratch you up. So we finished a project. This is the end of the summer. And we were going to have our lab gathering. And we said, hey, I know what we'll do. We'll burn these traps. Probably not the most environmentally friendly thing we've ever done, but I figured once a year we'd cut loose. And so we would like to make a tradition out of when we have a gear that we just use the heck out of, to sacrifice it to the gods. And in the first instance, we stacked these traps up in a big pyramid and literally had a person stand back and shoot a flaming arrow into the base of these traps.
This is dramatic. I'm impressed. Yeah.
Yes, very dramatic. It was well done. And of course, it sort of hooped and hollered. And I distinctly remember we had 2 new people in our lab at the time we were doing this, and they looked at us like we were crazy, probably because we were.
What had they gotten themselves into? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, very cool. And I think this tradition, this sort of ceremonial burning of the traps to signify the end of their life in your laboratory it's kind of a fun tradition to have. Very cool. The first I've heard of it yet, believe it or not.
Oh, yeah. We think we're groundbreakers with that.
Yep. Well, Joel, fantastic tradition to share with us today. And I love hearing about the different things that labs do across the world, because I think these traditions are what link people together as you pass through the laboratory and move on to different things, because it's sort of a transient group of people that you're with. So these things kind of link people together over the years and generations. So wonderful to hear about one of your own traditions. And next, I'd like to talk about the big questions in your mind, Joel. I know as a researcher, you get to answer so many exciting questions, but I want to know about one of these questions you haven't yet had a chance to answer. So can you tell us today, if we gave you everything, if the normal barriers in science, things like funding and staff and technology and feasibility, were not a problem, what is the question you would want to answer?
One of our pipe dreams in our lab is to more quantitatively link habitat to the health of fisheries. So what I mean by that is everybody appreciates habitat. Everybody would say habitat is important. But beyond that, our field really struggles to say X amount of habitat equals X amount of fish. And that's important when you think about some of the changes we've had in habitat availability. So globally, we've lost something on the order of 85% of all oyster reefs or shellfish reefs.
Oh, wow.
We've lost something on the order of 30% of all seagrass meadows. We've lost something on the order of 30% of our marshes. And these things are thought to be essential habitat for little fishes, some big fishes, for shrimps, for crabs. So we don't really understand well enough that relationship between habitat supporting fishes or fisheries. We have lots of models for the health of fishes that managers use. And those models have nothing that represents habitat because we don't understand the relationship in any quantitative way. And sometimes even our qualitative understanding is fairly poor. So if you think about oyster reefs, we've lost, again, 85%. In North Carolina, some estimates are 99% of our oyster reefs. And no one can tell you how the animals in our sounds and estuaries have responded. And so that's very frustrating and problematic because many of us would like to restore habitats and get them back to a more pristine state. But none of us can promise the users and the taxpayers, if you spend the money to do that, you'll benefit by this much fish production. So an experiment that I would love to see run would be very large-scale restoration. You could pick one of our river systems or a sound and try to restore dozens and maybe hundreds of acres of habitat, if it were oyster reefs, let's say, to try to get the system back to having habitat availability like it used to be pre-industrial era. And then be able to sample in a way to say, wow, this system just has no more fishes than it did or 10 times more fishes, and to really run an experiment at that large of a scale. One other experiment that I would love to see run, again, this sort of comes from frustration, is studying the impacts of the oil spill in the Gulf has been really hard. We didn't have that much baseline data to understand the way these systems looked like before the spill. And being able to sample in enough places at the right scale has been difficult. There are all sorts of reasons why this has been impossible, but I'm sort of fringe lunatic and I keep advocating for it, is if we could get permission and the funds to very responsibly, to the degree possible, go in and perhaps at football field scales, do very targeted oiling of marshes in a manipulation where we can sample before and after and have control sites where no oiling happens. That ability to control the conditions and control the system is often what gives us that strong inference to be able to say, if a marsh gets oiled, this is what will happen. When we're doing sort of emergency room science and post hoc triage after an event like an oil spill or some other form of injury, we really struggle to be confident about predictive power. There are social reasons and there are ethical reasons and there are some ecological reasons why oiling a marsh at a football field scale in the name of science may not be good. But from my experience, trying to unravel the effects of the past spill and then trying to have some sort of concrete ability to project what will happen for the Gulf in the future, I think we as a field would learn a lot, and therefore it could be worth the cost of doing that sort of experiment.
And I think you brought up a really great point here that you never really had a reason to collect all the pre-data before these catastrophic events. But yeah, certainly once they happened, it would have been so helpful to know what the impact was. So
yeah, and this may come from sort of some appreciation of history, but I really, really like monitoring data. When something unexpected happens, those are the data we all want. Those programs are often very hard to fund because
there's no immediate need, right?
Exactly. And most of our funding happens on 2 to 3 year cycles. And so it's hard to build a program that lasts 30 years. You've got to hit 10 different funding sources. I think that creeped up and bit us, so to speak, in the Gulf because there wasn't this baseline of conditions that we could draw on. There are lots of pieces of data that run back through time, but nothing as coordinated as it probably needed to be. Nothing in the deeper ocean. In the case of the Gulf spill, many of the impacts may be in the deeper ocean where we have very scant data. And the problem is funding it. We can't fund all things all the time, so we have to make tough decisions.
Certainly. And I think this is one of the challenges in science right now is just the funding situation is so tight that a lot of great research is not seeing the light of day. And I think some of these big questions in science we're sort of inching slowly towards, but the funding would definitely help in so many cases. So great to hear about the big questions on your mind, Joel. And we've talked a lot about your adventures in science and your journey. And I want to now have you reflect back on your journey and share with us what you might consider is the best piece of advice that you yourself received along the way.
Well, self-evaluation is pretty tough, and I may be giving myself too much credit, but I've always tried to take advice. I can't always do it, but at least I give it an effort, like save money or go to class or do well in school. Mm-hmm. And so my answer is somewhat maybe counterintuitive, but it's ultimately to be successful, I think, despite all that advice, is in the day, follow your gut. You know what you want best. You know how you rank different aspects of your life. So if you're faced with a choice between different schools or different graduate programs or different jobs or different research aspects, your best chance of success is probably where your gut's telling you. And you don't get to clone yourself and try 8 different things.
If only we could, that'd be great. Yeah.
Yeah. Or in my case, that'd be bad.
Right.
8 of me running around. But so you never get to know if the grass would have been greener, but you can try to inform yourself. And this comes from a fairly rash person, but still try to inform yourself and then follow your gut and then sort of do the best you can.
Certainly. Well, I think this is fantastic advice, listeners. If you are at one of these crossroads right now, listen to your heart, follow your gut, and just go with it. I think any decision you make, you have to make it the right decision for you once you're on that path. So
that's well said.
Great advice, Joel. Can you tell our listeners now how they can reach out to learn more about you and your work?
Sure. I'm at the Institute of Marine Sciences in Morehead City, North Carolina. We have a very nice website. It is ims.unc.edu. From that webpage, you'll find a link to our fisheries lab's website. My email is jfodrie@unc.edu. Happy to receive emails. And those are probably the quickest and most informative ways to get a hold of us.
Perfect. Well, Joel, thank you for sharing that with us today. Listeners, definitely check out the website, learn more about what Joel is working on. And Joel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed this.
Well, it was a pleasure for me to chat with you as well. Listeners, I hope you've enjoyed our conversation and learned a little something. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science. Your voyage to the lives of today's exceptional scientists has just begun. You can find everything we talked about today, including our guests' favorite books, biographies, photos, and more, when you visit us at www.peoplebehindthescience.com. I look forward to seeing you next time on People Behind the Science.